Thanks for joining this presentation of the City of Charlottesville Inclusionary Zoning Analysis. I'm Callie Seltzer, a principal at HR&A Advisors.
And Phil Keff, partner at HR&A Advisors.
Today, we'll be talking you through the inclusionary zoning policy that is proposed for the City of Charlottesville. The Affordable Housing Plan, adopted in March of 2021, calls for the city to design an IZ policy that supports Charlottesville's housing needs and creates affordable housing that meets the needs that the market will otherwise not address. Based on identified needs and development feasibility findings, the consultant team, which consists of RHI, Code Studio, HR&A Advisors, and the city, has recommended an inclusionary zoning policy that requires affordable housing for any housing development that includes more than 10 units and offers incentives to any development with 9 or less units that also include affordable housing. Summary of this policy is included on this slide below. The affordability level is set at 60% of area median income for the City of Charlottesville. 10 or more units would require 10% of units to be affordable. 9 or less units is voluntary. The term of affordability is 99 years or in perpetuity. It is important that the quality of the affordable units matches that of the market rate units. They are to be of equal size and evenly distributed throughout these properties. This would apply to all residential areas of Charlottesville, including the general residential, medium, and higher intensity residential zones, as defined in the future land use map. The city will be providing a series of incentives for affordable housing in this inclusionary zoning policy. There will be a density bonus of 25% for units 10 or more, and there will be a 2-unit bonus in the general residential areas and a 4-unit bonus in the medium intensity zones. In addition, there's a parking reduction of up to 50%. Today, we'll be walking through Cville Plans Together, what is inclusionary zoning, and the analysis that the team has conducted of high intensity residential areas and the general residential and medium intensity areas, including the financial feasibility of an inclusionary zoning policy, a rate of change analysis, and recommendations for the policy. The team has been working with the city to rewrite the existing zoning code to support housing affordability across the city. The Affordable Housing Plan was adopted in March of 2021. The comprehensive plan was updated and adopted in November of 2021. The third piece of Cville Plans Together is the zoning ordinance rewrite, which is an ongoing part of this process. Various zoning tools, such as inclusionary zoning, are being evaluated by the team in support of the city's affordable housing goals as defined in the Affordable Housing Plan. Currently, there are 2 main zoning tools used for increasing housing affordability in the city: proffers, which are offered during rezoning processes, and special use permits often include conditions. Going forward, we're looking at 5 new zoning tools for increasing affordable housing. The first is to allow more units on every lot zoned today for a single unit. The second is to allow more rental and ownership options. The third is to identify and create zoning incentives for increasing affordability. Fourth, adopting the inclusionary zoning policy. And fifth, creating a toolkit to avoid displacing at-risk communities with particular attention to sensitive community areas.
I'm going to talk through what exactly inclusionary zoning is before we get into the specifics of the policy and the analysis we completed for Charlottesville. An inclusionary zoning policy is intended to encourage developers to provide affordable housing in exchange for incentives. Often those incentives are density bonuses, parking reductions, or tax abatements. The affordable units are set at below market rate, and we usually use the term area median income, or AMI, to refer to different levels of rent and income levels we'll be serving. There's an appendix at the end of this presentation that actually describes the different AMI levels for the city of Charlottesville that you may want to reference. As we design an inclusionary zoning policy, we're really trying to balance the public policy objectives of depth of affordability, so how much lower we can make the rent compared to market rate, and what portion of units within a property can actually be restricted on their income. So we want to restrict as many units at the greatest level of affordability as possible, but we have to balance that against the feasibility of actually being able to develop the project. So is it financially feasible to actually complete the construction and operate the property? given the reduced level of rents. Creating a policy that has deep levels of affordability and high numbers of units, but isn't feasible, doesn't actually lead to the creation of affordable units. It actually blocks development overall. And then creating a policy that doesn't ask for enough affordability leaves affordable units uncreated. So the goal here for all this is try to balance it and see how to achieve the most benefit. An inclusionary zoning policy is quite complicated with a number of features. There's 4 key areas. We're focusing primarily on the policy components, but the administrative portion is extremely important as well and will be addressed in later conversations. So there are the requirements, affordability level. So what income level, how much is rents being restricted? What portion of units? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Is it 8%? What portion? And then how long will the property stay affordable? Is this permanently affordable? Is this affordable over a 10 or 15-year period? Is this affordable over just for the initial tenants? The other requirement is the possibility of an in lieu fee option. We are not going to get deep into that part of the conversation in this presentation, but it can be addressed. And this is the option to pay a fee as opposed to building the units or creating the units actually in a property. So pay money towards affordable housing, but not actually include any affordable units in a building. Geographic locations. So inclusionary zoning policies can be done to cover different portions of a city. In this case, as Callie described previously, we are talking about covering all of Charlottesville with different requirements based on building size, but you can design policies that cover different areas. And then incentives. There's different types of incentives to be offered. What incentives actually are appropriate? What incentives actually have a real impact? It's fine to offer an incentive, but if it doesn't change the economics or the financial feasibility of the development, it's not actually an effective incentive. So what are the incentives that will actually be effective and how long? And then the last section, as I mentioned, is administrative policy. There's all kinds of rules and processes that need to be established. How you screen and select tenants, how you deal with rounding issues, how timing of this works, what the approval processes are, overall management, make sure that the policy is actually being enforced and monitored. That will come as the policy is put together. The administration policies are just as important of the policy components because they make sure the policy actually does what you mean it to do, but they need to be designed after you set policy components. The team's inclusionary analysis is based on the city's future land use map. So this is the process we have. The FLUME. We do a lot of acronyms in here. Hopefully we spelled the most out, but we're primarily focused on general residential, medium intensity residential, and higher intensity residential, basically all the types of residential property.
As a reminder, general residential is typically up to 3.5 stories. Medium intensity is up to 4.5 stories, but often typically 3 stories. And in the city, higher intensity residential can be up to 5 stories based on the future land use map.
So as we actually start to apply the policy that Callie put forward, so mandatory requirement for properties with more than 10 units and a voluntary inclusionary policy for those with 9 or less. We gave some examples of how this might play out. These are hypothetical examples, but we think they're helpful in being illustrative. So in general residential, you might have a development where you are going to build 3 homes and you then choose to include an affordable unit and you're eligible for a 2-unit bonus. So therefore the development become a 5-unit voluntary inclusionary development. Similarly, if you were in a medium intensity area, you might have been looking at a development of 5 housing units and decided to include 1 inclusionary unit, and then you can actually build 4 additional units. So you actually end up with a development of 9. If you were taking on a larger apartment building, a 60-unit property, then you would be required to build 10% of those, or 6 of them would require to be affordable, and you would get a density bonus in that situation of 12 units. Exact examples differ, but these are helpful illustrations. So now we're going to get into some of the financial feasibility analysis we went through. I think an important thing to keep in mind as we go into this section is that all of our analysis is intended to look at the programmatic effect of this and the general, like how it would look across multiple deals. There will always be examples of deals that have different sets of financing and different conditions. This policy is trying to reflect the full range of that. There'll be specific examples that differ. So we looked at a couple different types of development about what's actually happening in Charlottesville, and we focused on the higher intensity residential areas. So mid-rise rental, you have low, think of that as 4 to 5 stories. You have low rise, think of that as 2 to 3 stories with a walk-up. You have townhouses. I think all of you are very familiar with some of the townhouses being developed. And then you have low-rise rental housing, which is a little less common. And we gave some examples of actual projects in Charlottesville here. So we're looking at all this when we do our financial analysis, trying to understand the financial feasibility. I'm going to walk you from left to right through how we look at financial feasibility. And this is all focused on rental. Concept is very similar for sale, but slightly different. So there's a set of costs to development. One, there's returns. So that's actually the money the developer makes. There's soft costs. Think of those as architecture, engineering costs to help design and make sure a property is going to work. Holding costs, pay taxes while you're holding it. Hard costs, that's bricks and sticks, the actual physical part of building a property. And then you have to pay for the land. So all those costs have to get financed. And so they go over and they drive the project financing. And you're financing that for development with a combination of debt, so a mortgage, kind of like the mortgage you might have for your home, and equity, which is an ownership investment that generally has a higher return. So there's the project financing, and then there's operating expense. You have to maintain the property. You have to pay for utilities for common area. You have to pay property taxes. So there's all those things together, the project financing and the operating costs, they together rep the total operating costs, and they really set what's the rent necessary to actually support those. You got to get to that required rent if you are going to actually make the development feasible. If you can't meet that required rent, then it's not a feasible project. So that gets to the revenue side. So how many properties do you have together paying the rent? So when you create an inclusionary zoning policy, the cost to develop really hasn't necessarily changed. We're talking about the same apartment buildings in the same locations, but you have reduced the amount of rent. You've made some of that rent affordable by reducing the amount of rent. That creates a gap in development on average. That reduces the feasibility in development. And so what we start to look at is, okay, how big is that gap? And what are the different ways we can offset it and actually keep the ability to develop roughly equal? So that's really starting to look really at incentives. So what are the land use and subsidy incentives? And so land use, when I say land use, I mean the regulations about what's allowed to be built where, rules about setbacks, rules about height, rules about density, rules, frankly, about the approval process. And then subsidy is actually public money going into a deal. So that might be tax abatement or actually public loans or grants. We're not going to look a lot at subsidy, and I'll get into that more later, because that's a limited resource and we want that to be targeted to our deeper levels of affordability. We're going to focus mainly on regulatory tools. So I talked about this a little bit earlier in the deck, but I think it's important to revisit, is we're trying to find an appropriate level that works across a range of projects where we don't give it insufficient incentives to make deals work, because that'll lead to fewer development deals and actually less net affordable units. We also want to make sure that we don't give too many incentives here. So that's the middle option where we're really leaving affordable units we could ask for on the table. We're trying to get to the far right here where it's actually balancing, get the incentives just right. And we'll lay out our analysis about how we looked at that and where we ended up. I've talked about incentives, I talked about development feasibility, and then one of the key parts of an affordable housing analysis is how deep to go in the level of affordability. And there can be more than one right answer. There are trade-offs to doing this. As you saw at the beginning and Callie explained, we set the target based on our analysis at 60% AMI. We set it at 60% AMI because there's significant market need there. The market is not serving those households. And it's a level where we can get 10%, a relatively significant number of units produced. As you go at deeper levels of affordability, the more the rent has to be reduced. So we give this example here. We have, if you were serving households at 80% AMI, then you basically have to reduce rent about $450 a month lower than market. If you go down all the way to 50% AMI, you're talking about just shy of $1,100 in rent. As your rent goes down, part of that money goes to help pay for debt on the property or financing for the property. That goes down and creates a gap. So that's part of how we try to think about this, is deeper affordability really has a significantly larger impact on the viability of the project. So we got to trade that off. We want to serve the area of greatest need, but we also need to get significant units. And deeper affordability, just it costs more, and that's something we got to keep in mind. So to do this constructability analysis, we took the types of units I mentioned earlier that we saw common in the market, mid-rise apartments, low-rise apartments, townhouses, and low-rise rehabilitation. And we frankly pulled market data, and we had a lot of conversations with developers and landowners and actors in your market, and to make sure we had accurate assumptions about where the market's at. Now, the reality is the market is dynamic and it's constantly moving. It's been moving a lot in particular in the past few months. So we make sure, and we'll get into this a little bit more, made sure to build tolerance range and sensitivity, so ranges in everything, so that there can be some shift in the market and the program will still work. So we looked at a set of incentives. And I talked about this. So one is development intensity. So it's higher level density. It's also just design and development standards. So are there requirements about the level of buildings being built to that might things make lower costs? So maybe you're requiring bird glass on certain properties and you're going to stop requiring bird glass, and that's going to have a cost savings and therefore a reduction in rent as possible. Also, frankly, a faster, clearer, more streamlined approval process can have real savings. It creates certainty. It saves costs, particularly in the early stages of development that are actually those costs are more expensive dollar for dollar. That money costs more, which is a weird thing to say, but that money costs more because it's higher risk. And then we looked at tax and fee abatements, and then the need for negotiated infrastructure improvements. Right now, when Charlottesville creates new development, it's often negotiating with developers to pay for stormwater infrastructure or upgrade sewer lines. And those are really important costs for the city that need to be covered, but also put costs on projects. So how does that fit into this conversation? After both talking with developers about where changes would actually impact their finances, and talking with the city about what's feasible and getting feedback from advocates, we settled that we focused primarily on two areas: development intensity and design and development standards, particularly reduced parking. And we'll talk about those a bit more as we go forward. So we're looking at increasing building heights, so on the intensity side, increasing building heights, decreasing lot sizes. On increasing building heights, the biggest point to call out is that you cannot just assume you can increase the building height and that costs and everything else stay the same. There are certain inflection points where construction type changes. Most important for our analysis is where you have to move from a wood frame construction, which is not cheap, but relatively cheap compared to steel and concrete. And we put that limit right around 5 stories. And then the level of density we actually think the market will absorb. So we laid out those different assumptions, as you can see bullet pointed here. Then decreasing lot size is really particularly important for townhouses. So how tightly you can build those. And we looked at a marginal increase in density at 20%. And then reducing parking minimums. So we looked at how parking minimums are the required amount of parking that a developer could build. The developer could always choose to build more, but what are they required to build? And we did analysis on 10 to 50% and ended up with a recommendation of actually at the 50%. And we'll talk more about how we modeled that out. There is a limit as you reduce parking requirements about how much if you reduce that parking, when it starts to impact the actual rents households are willing to pay for their apartment. And that can undermine and limit how the financial benefits of reducing parking minimums. And we'll talk about that a bit later. So there's not one place where every single deal is feasible or infeasible. Each deal has its own particular financing and own particular circumstances. We look at 2 market metrics to really gauge these and understand which deals are feasible, which deals are borderline, which deals are infeasible. We look at yield on cost and equity multiple, both of which are defined here. Happy to discuss them with folks more if they're interested, but I'm gonna just leave the definitions up here and go through how we actually apply those. So we set some boundaries about what's borderline, what's feasible, and what's infeasible, as you'll see laid out here, for both yield on cost and equity multiple. Then we started to apply these to the different construction types I laid out before: mid-rise new construction, low-rise new construction, townhouse new construction, and low-rise rehabilitation. We tested that against just current market rate, current conditions, how easy, not easy, but how feasible it is to build those developments in the market. And then we looked at a set of different levels of affordability and different portions. So 10% at 16%, 60%, 15% at 60%, 8% at 50%, and so on. So that we had a range of options. This doesn't mean these are the only affordability levels or percentages Charlottesville could choose to enact. There's almost a limitless number of combinations that could be created. We did these because they're clear, easy marking points that tell us kind of what is and isn't feasible. As you can see in this diagram, mid-rise new construction and townhouse new construction are often feasible in the market, generally feasible. That I think probably aligns with many of your experiences. Those are the kinds of developments we're seeing primarily in the Charlottesville market. Low-rise new construction can work if the right site can be found, but it's harder to do. Low-rise rehabilitation really is much more difficult to do and requires a particular site or a special building or a good price or some other advantage. It's not generally feasible in the market. Doesn't mean those developments don't happen. It's just not as easy to do. So then we started to test out some different incentives and how do they start to shift things. So we looked at increasing building heights and decreasing lot sizes and how that started to shift things. And it actually started to make, starts to make some of the 10% at affordable and mid-rise new construction borderline feasible, but not enough to overall make any affordability requirement feasible without significantly impacting development. Doesn't mean you couldn't put the requirement in place, but it would significantly impact development. Then we looked at, okay, what about just reducing parking minimums? It had some benefits and started to move things along the edges, but wasn't enough to, again, make anything. It had most of its value in mid-rise construction, partially because of the development type and the cost of parking in those situations, but wasn't enough to move the needle to anything, to make it work on its own. Then we went farther on parking reduction. And if you cut parking reduction in half, it really does start to make affordable development and other developments feasible, at least on the mid-rise construction. And that's because the parking costs, that type of parking is most expensive to build. It has much less benefit for low-rise and almost no benefit for townhouse or rehabilitation. The big caveat on this that we'll call out is, as you reduce parking to this level, there is, in other markets, an impact on the rents households are willing to pay, because there are not a lot of examples of the significantly lower level of parking. There's not clear data on how much rents would react. So we have to take everything in this analysis a little bit more with a grain of salt, because there's not as much market data on it. Okay, so what if we start combining density and parking reductions? We start to see that, okay, you can actually get to 10% at 60% AMI. It's feasible on mid-rise and new construction. It's feasible on townhouses. And it starts to be borderline on low-rise new construction. It's still not great for low-rise rehabilitation, but those projects didn't work well even in a baseline case, so it's not a change there. So we haven't made things worse. That's just a challenge that already exists in the market. And so we start to see that this is how we start to zero in, like, this is an option, it's 10% affordable housing. It's possible that you could choose to go after 8% with units at 50% median income. That's going to do more harm to the amount of development in the market, but is an area where there's also some borderline viability. Excuse me. So really coming back to our initial recommendations that Callie went through at the top, what we're looking at here based on that is a requirement at 60% of area median income for all developments of 10 units and up. For developments of 9 units or less, we're making it voluntary, and we made it that way because for 9 or less, there are not enough market rate units to help cover the cost of the affordable unit. So you got to make, either you're going to block that development or you're going to make it voluntary. We went for permanent affordability over a long term. You know, this is a high priority for the community and can be built into, if it is part of the original project financing, it can be built in. And then we had a heavy focus to make sure that the affordable units are of equal quality. And that really means same size and not all concentrated in the basement. They need to be evenly, you know, they can't be tiny units hidden in the basement. They have to be appropriately sized, equally sized, and distributed throughout the property. There's certainly examples of other communities having four doors or very tiny units that kind of undermine the purpose of the program. And then as we covered, I think pretty well here, we're talking about doing this throughout Charlottesville. Primarily the slides I've just presented will apply to higher intensity residential zones, and we'll get into the general and medium in just a moment. And then we're talking about a 10% density bonus and a parking reduction of up to 50%. So I'm going to hand things back over to Callie, who's going to walk through general residential and medium intensity.
Thanks, Philip. The team looked really closely at general residential and medium intensity areas in the city. In particular, and in response to a lot of community concern that change could happen quickly, we wanted to really understand what we call the rate of change, or how quickly would change be expected to happen based on various market factors, the number of new residential units that could be produced with this zoning change. So here's an example on this slide just showing, you know, a single family home that today is zoned for just a single unit. If that is changed to be zoned for up to 4 units while maintaining the original structure. So think about those kind of creative, you know, uses of other parts of the parcel to add some density on that parcel, maintaining that, you know, single family home. You can see an increase in the land value, right? The development potential of that lot has increased. So the underlying land value also increases. That same home would have a few options based on that potential increase in the land value. So if it stayed as a single family home, let's say that's a $460,000 home, great. Most people aren't going to, you know, just up and leave their house. It could also convert to a 4-unit townhouse or condo. There's some additional value that, say, a developer bought the house from that original owner. There's some additional value that could be, you know, realized through that upzoned property, or it could turn into apartments. So the sample property's got these 3 options if the single family owner that lives there now sells the property and or chooses to redevelop, you know, their own house. So once that property turns over, the new owner then would convert it to that highest, you know, highest option. We did not address in this presentation or this analysis the impact of potential long-term stay or say Airbnb, but happy to discuss that outside of this presentation as well. Our rate of expected change analysis is really based on a model of parcels in your study area, right? So for the city, we used the future land use map, and we identified all the areas that were either general residential or medium intensity. We recognize that this only covers a subset of properties in Charlottesville. It's about 10,000 parcels, and really there's more like 15,000 parcels citywide. And in reality, a lot of the city's affordable housing need will continue to be met through other parcels outside of general residential and outside of medium intensity. These are the areas where affordable housing development is happening today. We expect that it will continue to happen in the future. And again, we think there will be some special considerations for sensitive community areas, which are part of the longer ongoing engagement with the community around this issue and the determination of boundaries that the city will be setting. The team used a decision tree to actually model owners' decisions and response to these changes in zoning. So, for example, you know, if you have a certain kind of lot that has a certain kind of access, say it's front or rear or side access, not all options are available to those lots, right? You've got a structure that you could demolish or you could add on. And depending on some parking and easements and, lot size, general accessibility, you can't build an unlimited number of units there. So we looked at this parcel level data from the flume, and we really tried to confirm what all those requirements would be for an eligible property to be able to accommodate additional housing units on the site. Additional housing units on the site comes with additional need for access, parking, et cetera. We looked at that parcel data, we looked at all the market factors and also production estimates based on what an owner or someone who purchases a property might decide to do. What's their financial risk level? What's their tolerance level? How much are they able or willing to invest in your particular market in a particular kind of site? And then we established some market and development assumptions for what we'd say are prototypical new development typologies. And that was really, to be able to assess the total housing capacity on each parcel. And then lastly, this analysis tries to project the expected level of new housing production over 3 years, and we'll give it to you on an annual basis. So looking again at those development typologies, we looked at both conversion and new construction typologies. These could be built on, the parcel based on and really dependent on the lot width, the alley access. So you've got an attached cottage here, which has vehicle access in the front. That's a typical typology for Charlottesville. The second image is a duplex conversion with a carriage house that has vehicle access in the front. The third is a 8-plex vehicle access in the rear. And the other new construction example here is a townhouse court, or also known as auto court, which has vehicle access in the front. These typologies are explored in much more depth in the approach document that's also located on the Cville Plans Together website. The rate of expected change model relies on a number of assumptions. We talked to a number of local developers over a period of about 6 months. We also spoke with the city about projects that they've seen, developed recently, talked to other third-party sources, reviewed CBRE, CoStar, Zillow, data resources, and really tried to keep up with recent changes in the market to source these assumptions. Again, they're assumptions, they're not perfect, but this is where we set them, and our project can update the assumptions over time. So first, using a parcel-based map, we determined the lot width for every parcel in the city. So this is a major factor in determining whether more units can be accommodated on a site. Your lot width really does have an impact there. And then we filtered out those units that were not in the general residential or medium intensity areas based on the flume. We used Zillow and CoStar and appraisal values, and then we assigned an estimated sales price and or rent for the parcel in these areas. So, what would be the sales price of that parcel if it were sold today, and what would be the rents that could be charged for the property on that parcel. We were very concerned with rear vehicle access. It's kind of a very common need for properties of 2 or more units. So we overlaid all of the alleys to determine where were the parcels that had rear vehicle access. And this helps us understand where it would be easier to develop denser units. And from there, we assign them to one of 14 categories. And this is really depending on their access, if they have front or rear or side access, the width of the parcel, because that affects how many units you can develop, on each floor. And then the total number of parcels that fit that category. So we created this set of typologies to figure out how many parcels actually fit each of those categories. So again, we studied about 10,000 parcels, residential parcels in the city. And our initial findings are that 2% would turn over and be market viable for redevelopment. An even smaller portion is likely to be redeveloped. And this slide is really dense. We're happy to kind of walk through it in more detail, but I'm just going to take it left to right and try to explain how we came up with this analysis. So as we mentioned, there's 10,155 parcels in our analysis. As defined in the future land use map, those are your general residential and medium intensity areas. We know there will be special considerations for sensitive community areas based on the city's determination of those boundaries, and those areas are incorporated in the general residential today. Of those 10,155 parcels, we found that there's 1,716 market viable parcels. And so really that just means a redevelopment would make economic sense for that site, a redevelopment of the existing property. Most of those properties fell out. Most are not market viable. Redevelopment, is time intensive, cost intensive, and certainly we didn't factor that, additional kind of rising costs. We just looked at cost today, but it's getting more expensive right now. So in the next 3 years, imagining that, a number of parcels would fall out. That annual turnover rate here on the third column, we're looking at the total single family homes sold annually where redevelopment would actually be competitive. Those that are expected to be sold. And that's based on the average turnover between 2019 and 2021. So there would be 189 homes that would likely turn over based on historic data from those recent years. And if all of the market viable parcels that are expected to turn over were actually redeveloped, the total net new units that would be delivered to the market would be about 430, and that's on an annual basis. So in that year one, 430 net new units, and that would be across 189 properties. Lastly, on the far right, even though redevelopment might be the market optimal outcome for a number of these sites, we know that many people will choose to not redevelop these homes. And there's a number of reasons for that, including just personal preference for the existing single family home. A lot of, beautiful historic homes in Charlottesville, obviously, that are not going to just get torn down and rebuilt. There's also a certain level of developer capacity in the system, right? Financing is limited. Infill development doesn't just happen overnight. So there's a lot of physical, environmental, and other site-specific constraints. So what we've seen in all the other cities we've worked in is that, most cities that have increased density for single-family residential areas have really seen a very low share of market viable parcels get redeveloped. There will be parcels that get redeveloped. It will be spread across the city. And as we have shown here, we would expect on an annual basis for general residential and medium intensity, about 430 net new units, and that's citywide. It's also important to note that there's a certain width of property, and it's about 59 feet. Those are the parcels that are really considered the most market viable. Anything above 59 feet. Based on all of this, our initial findings are that townhomes, the townhome typology, would actually be the most likely infill type that we would be expecting to see delivered to the market. We think you would have some duplex units delivered, some duplex units with those cottage dwelling units, kind of that accessory unit on the back, 8-plex units and some townhomes. And mostly the townhome is the most viable typology for Charlottesville. And we just want to talk you through some of the considerations here as you think about what we've just presented. This rate of change is, again, just for general residential and medium intensity areas. And it's really based on a model that has, some limitations, right? So we looked at the residual land value, and that's the calculation that really helps you determine the market viability for every parcel. And that's thinking about, what would be the maximized developer yield. Buyer preferences that don't maximize that financial yield were not considered. The only parcel-specific considerations really were parcel width, the location, the right-of-way access, and the total parcel area. If you think about things like terrain or tree cover or easements or water, those really weren't considered because it's sort of impossible to do that citywide, but we do think those will overall reduce project viability. So the number or the rate of change would actually decrease. The number of units that would turn over would be fewer, given other factors that we didn't consider, like terrain, tree cover, easements, etc. Next, you'll see the model really is just looking at the supply side, right? And it's assuming that in the short term, less than 3 years, demand could absorb all the units that are delivered. As you start to do more of this infill, over time, there's fewer units, and that might ease demand, and that could change project viability. Next, and we talked a little bit about this, but you have a development ecosystem that includes developers and contractors and architects and engineers. They all go to get their financing from local, regional, national banks and or equity providers. And there's only a certain level of actual expertise in the market to do this kind of infill development, and it's expensive. And so that development expertise can lag the market demand. And we think that there can be a lag between that and when even if you permit it, doesn't mean that the actual redevelopment will happen due to that lag. So all of these limitations, in summary, really lead us to err on the side of overestimating the number of units that would actually turn over or be redeveloped in the general residential and medium intensity areas. We should not really consider the model, these results, to be a minimum, right? We really think that this is sort of the upward bound of the production. And we looked at it annually in the chart previously. So think about, the reality probably being less than what you've seen here. Talking a little bit about the affordability findings. So on our rate of change analysis, we wanted to understand, what would the market provide that's affordable given this, given the new zoning. And we've assumed that all property owners of lots zoned today for only a unit would be able to redevelop their properties by right. So that means that zoning, you wouldn't have to go get special permission or any legislative action to permit the redevelopment. Second, if the city requires an affordable unit as soon as a project exceeds 1 unit, we looked carefully at this. This would be called the kind of first additional unit. That second unit, if it was required to be affordable, we found that very few, if any, parcels in the city would ever get redeveloped unless there would be public subsidy involved. So the affordability incentives that were applied in the previous presentation that Philip walked through, the high intensity residential areas, we talked about parking and additional density. When you apply those kinds of incentives in general residential and medium intensity areas, you really don't get sufficient financial benefit to make new affordable units financially viable. Those incentives just don't have the same impact in these areas as they do in the high intensity residential areas. So in summary, and based on all this analysis, the team is recommending an inclusionary zoning policy that supports one affordable unit at 60% of AMI for every 9 units of market rate and includes the proper incentives to offset those costs. We recommend establishing a requirement that 10% of the units in any development of 10 or more be affordable. For projects that are 9 units or less, we recommend increasing the cap on the developable units by 2 units in those general residential areas and 4 units in the medium intensity areas. And this is really as long as it doesn't exceed the 9 units, including that bonus, right? So the purpose here is to allow for the development of more affordable housing, but without any public subsidy needed or philanthropic subsidy needed to cover the gap between the cost to develop the unit and the affordable rent or price. And why are we doing this? Really want to think through, what's been delivered in your market since 2000. This slide tries to drive home the single family detached, the single family attached typologies, 2 to 4 units, 5 to 9 units, 10 plus units. In the past 21 years, there's really been little to no what we'd call missing middle housing offerings. Housing in Charlottesville, is typically single family detached or single family attached. Very few new home ownership opportunities being provided. And so the key recommendation here, and I think this really gets to the why, is if your lot is zoned for a single unit today, it can be redeveloped or renovated for additional units by right, and that's citywide. And that this really has the effect of creating affordable homeownership opportunities that don't rely on subsidy. So you're going to get more affordable housing for no additional public cost. Here's an example of a single family detached home today. It costs you $600,000 to buy it in the Charlottesville market. You would need a minimum household income of $140,000 or more to be able to afford the mortgage on a house that costs $600,000. The household area median income level for $140,000, that's 120% of AMI. And we know from the Affordable Housing Plan that the need in the 30% AMI, 40% AMI, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of AMI, it's really it's a deepening need across all those income bands. And just increasingly out of reach for a monthly mortgage of $4,000 or more. With this by right zoning change, that same single family house, detached home, could be, sold by the existing owner, purchased by a developer who chooses to do infill. The cost to purchase this infill townhouse would be $375,000 to $450,000. And we have found that that's affordable for a household that's making $85,000 to $100,000. And that household's at 80 to 90% of AMI in Charlottesville today, and their monthly mortgage would be $2,400 to $2,700. This is not saying that we're going to solve creating affordable home ownership for all income bands in Charlottesville, but it does have the impact of unlocking some opportunities for people in the $85,000 to $100,000 range. Just flashing you guys the housing affordability charts that are in the appendix here. And with that, we will conclude our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.